Leaves a little bit to be desired. Today, I was looking at the title of my talk, Science in the Early Childhood Curriculum, and thinking that following a field trip to a museum, standing like a god, and having some playtime, that it was probably a little bit ambitious. So I've decided to change the topic to fun with science. A couple of years ago, I was visiting a friend in Florida. And at the time, my friend had a 5-year-old child. He's now a little bit older than that. And a storm was brewing. And as the storm got closer, the palm tree fronds began to flap. And flap more violently and more violently. And Mikey, my friend's son, looked up and asked the both of us, "Where's the wind coming from?" Well, ever the educator, I grabbed a moment and turned the question around and asked him where he thought the wind came from. And Mikey looked around very thoughtfully, as a 5-year-old would, turned around, looked in different directions, saw the palm tree fronds flapping wildly, and said, "The palm trees, they're making the wind." Now think about that for a second. What was Mikey doing? He was doing science. He was doing real science. Science begins with a question. Now, most of us adults think that a child's first words are mom, dad, but while they may be the first words, they're not the most common words that a child will speak. Any parent, any teacher will tell you the most common word is what? What, why, how, quickly followed by what, why, how. No sooner have you answered a what question or a why question, you're asked what, why, how once again. So that is where science begins, with the asking of questions. What is wind? How do we find out what is wind? And if you look at the conclusion, the theory that Mikey reached, that a palm frond created the wind, well, that's based on observation, which is what scientists do. Mikey had experienced wind generated by fans. He had moved his hand and felt wind generated by that. And if your hand can make a little bit of wind, why couldn't a palm tree make a lot of wind? And why couldn't a lot of palm trees make a lot of wind? Now, we know that Mikey came up with the wrong theory, but that's okay. That's what science is all about. Scientists come up with wrong answers every single day. It's okay to be wrong with science. It's okay to be wrong all the time. Well, not all the time. Eventually you want to get to a right answer. But the road to a right answer is paved with wrong answers. So, now that we knew what Mikey thought where wind came from, what could we do to take the next step? We went into the house and we found a pinwheel in his toy box. And he held up the pinwheel and I asked him, "Is it moving?" I said, "Well, why don't we take it outside and see what happens?" And we took it outside and sure enough, in the wind, it began to move. We brought it back inside. I asked him to blow on it. And I then asked him, after having these experiences, if he really thought the fronds were making the wind. And he thought thoughtfully for a few minutes, and he said no. And we talked about the pinwheel and how it required a force, wind, to move it. And it must be the wind making the palm trees wave and not the palm trees making the wind. So it took over an hour to get to there, but we got there. And what we were doing was teaching science, real science. Too often, particularly in early childhood, we teach science as a collection of facts and vocabulary. We teach them what a caterpillar is. We teach them what a butterfly is. We show them a picture of a butterfly. We show them a picture of a caterpillar. And then we move on to the next topic. But we don't teach them the process of science. That is usually lost to the upper grades if it ever happens. One way that we can dispel the wrong answers that children have is by turning to books. Unfortunately, if we look at an early childhood classroom, what kind of books do we find? We find a lot of fiction. Do we find science books? If there is one, it's dusty, it's in the back corner, it's under another pile of books, it's about this thick, and it belongs in a high school classroom. Or it's an encyclopedia. It's not meant for an early learner. What we need to do is to give early learners authentic reading materials that are science-based, where they can turn to, something that they can open up and something they can understand, not necessarily something that they can read. And in there, they can find the answers to many of their questions, the answers that they can't make observations from in the real world. Coming up with an authentic reading material will give students a purpose for reading. And we know that when a student or anyone approaches reading with a purpose, they are going to have better comprehension rather than being assigned reading. Also, being given an authentic looking product will increase comprehension. If we give them something with lots and lots of scaffolding, like we see in a textbook, it looks like a textbook. How many of you go home, how many of you are going to go home tonight and open up a textbook and read it for pleasure? None of us are. It is the most contrived piece of literature imaginable. How we learn from that is anyone's guess. And in products that look authentic, we can teach a variety of topics. For example, here we have a story about tigers. But as a teacher, what else can we teach on this page? Well, if we look at the title here, Purr with Tigers, as a teacher, I'm going to start with that P. I've got a whole lesson on P. I'm going to start with purr, and I'm going to move to pop, and I'm going to move to purple, and we're going to own the P sound. I'm going to spend an hour or more just on this page with my students talking about the letter P. And then I'm going to turn the page, and what do I see here? The anatomy of a tiger. So I'm learning about tigers, and the first thing we have is the head of a tiger here. And I'm going to ask my students, how many of you have a head? Raise your hand. How is your head like a tiger's head? How is it different than a tiger's head? What's the next part on the tiger? A tiger has fur. Do you have fur? Or do you have hair? How is your hair like a tiger's fur? How is a tiger's fur like a cat's fur, a dog's fur? Do you have paws or hands? What are we doing? We're teaching science, but we're also teaching a fundamental skill for early learners, comparing and contrasting. From there, we can go into sorting, classification. We can look at a tiger is yellow, or I'm sorry, a tiger is orange. How are these animals alike? Are they all big? Are they all small? They're all orange. So we begin a sorting activity, and we can do lots of sorting activities that build off of this. And then, of course, we can move on to where does orange come from? How do we make orange? It's a combination of red and yellow. But reading can only take us so far with early learners. We need active play-based science. And we need real-life experiences and observations to teach scientific concepts. If I had two rocks up here, a big rock and a small rock, and I told you the big rock weighed 3 kilograms, and the small rock weighed 3 kilograms, which one weighs more? We would say the same. But what would an early learner say? A big rock and a small rock, They're going to conflate big with heavy and small with weight, with light. The reason for that is they have no concept of density. How do we teach that to them? We bring in a 3-kilogram big rock and a 3-kilogram small rock, and we have them pick them up. Maybe something a little bit lighter than 3 kilograms. And then they experience that. But then we bring out a pail, and we say, we have a big pail that weighs 3 kilograms, and we have a small pail, and it weighs 3 kilograms. Which one weighs more? What are they going to answer? They weigh the same. Why? Because their concept load is stable. They have to now pick it up and experience it. And then we have to bring in 2 toys, one big and one small, that weigh the same. And after they experience it many, many times, they'll begin to see a pattern. And then when you ask the question, I have a chair that weighs 3 kilograms that's really big, and I have a chair that weighs 3 kilograms that's really small, which one weighs more? They're going to answer the same. But it's going to take time to get there. But that's okay, because what have they done? They've acted like scientists. They've conducted observations, and they've done real science just like a real scientist does it, not pretend science. But we have to be careful with this model, because a strict constructivist model of teaching science to, as we do with older students, does not work with younger students. They need scaffolding, they need guidance that an older student doesn't need. Too often, in our early learner classrooms, we teach science as arts and crafts. And that's as far as we go. Are we teaching science? Absolutely not. We're teaching arts and crafts, we're teaching fine motor skills, we're teaching gross motor skills, and we're making wonderful artistic projects, and we might be teaching some vocabulary. We might be teaching some totally disconnected facts that are totally meaningless because I don't have any context in which to put them in. But I've done a nice art project, and sometimes they seem to relate to science, and I think that there's a place for arts and crafts, science-related activities. They're a great way for building vocabulary, for building certain knowledge base, but they're not really teaching the process of science. And it is the process of science that is so important to young children. So what we need with our youngest learners is a guided, gradual approach to science play, where we begin with a teacher doing an experiment for the students, then handing off a little bit of the decision making to the students, and then letting them play on their own. And that may come at different times for different students and for different groups of students. We also need to learn how to pair our students differently. We might have some students who are excellent at science, some who are great at math. They own a certain domain. So why not pair a science expert with a math expert? And suddenly they are sharing their expertise with each other. And what do we end up with? 2 students who are experts in 2 domains. And then they become experts in 3 and 4 domains. And it cascades along the way. And what we end up with, though, is a teacher who needs a lot of training. This doesn't come out of anywhere. Teachers who can abandon the old know-it-all, sage on the stage role and become true partners in education with their students, where they're willing to hand off some authority for their learning to the students, to not necessarily know all the answers. That's a brave teacher. And it's a teacher who's really got to be confident in what she's doing. And she also has to have the support of her administration to do that. Because when an administrator asks her, what are you going to do today? Her answer is, I don't know. And she won't know until she's in the classroom and her students and her decide what they're doing today. But in the process, she's going to create students that are not only ready for kindergarten and grade 1, but students who are ready for life, students who are ready for careers, students who know how to operate in the real world. And that is, after all, what we all want. And the reason why we're in education is to prepare students for lives to come. So, does anyone have any questions? Okay, thank you.